This is Bloomberg Daybreak Weekend, our global look at the top stories in the coming week from our Daybreak anchors all around the world. Straight ahead on the program, Wall Street braces for a key jobs report. I'm Tom Busby in New York. I'll have that story.
I'm Caroline Hepker here in London, where we're asking what's next for the UK's car industry.
I'm Brian Curtis in Hong Kong. We look at what to expect and what not to expect when China and the European Union get together for a summit.
I'm Kaylee Lyons in Washington, where the CEOs of the U.S.'s biggest banks are getting set to testify in the Senate.
That's all straight ahead on Bloomberg Daybreak Weekend. The business news you need to wrap up your week. Available on Apple, Spotify, the Bloomberg Business app, and everywhere you get your podcasts.
Good day to you. I'm Tom Busby. We begin today's program with a focus on the economy. While many expect the Fed to put further rate increases on hold for now, each key economic report takes on more importance. After signs that U.S. consumer spending and the labor market may be cooling, along with inflation, this coming Friday we get the November jobs report. And helping us break down what it all means and what we should expect to see is Anna Wong, chief U.S. economist with Bloomberg Economics, and Michael McKee, Bloomberg's international economics and policy correspondent. Now let's start with some of the data that we've seen over the last week or so. Americans slowing their spending in October, personal spending, along with personal incomes, both rising 0.2% in October. Mike, that's in line with forecasts, but not a very encouraging number, is it?
It's not bad, given the month and the fact that September was a very strong month for spending, and it was also back-to-school month. We haven't seen in the October numbers yet the holiday spending that is to come. So you really have to sort of average it out over a couple of months, and we'll see how October turns out. I thought one of the most interesting things, though, was on the income side, because incomes were definitely restrained, and the biggest drop was in wages. After many months of 0.5% or 0.4% gain in wages each month, we only saw 0.1% gain. Now, 1 month does not make a trend. We saw some months last year where we had negative percentages for wage gains, and it rebounded. But if this is a sign that labor markets are loosening, and if this continues, it's kind of what the Fed wants to see, wage gains coming down to a more sustainable level, and therefore fits the narrative that they're hoping comes true of a soft landing.
Anna, what do you think about that?
Yeah, what struck me about what Mike just said is the narrative. What is the narrative right out there right now? So this past week, we saw a lot of Fed speaker came out, and I detected a visibly dovish pivot in all of them. Particularly, most notable to me is Chris Waller and Loretta Mester, both of whom are among the most hawkish Fed officials. And it sounded to me that they have become more confident that the labor market is loosening, wage growth is slowing, and that inflation is definitely on track to have a couple more good months of low monthly print. And I think what the PCE report last week showed us, as Mike was saying, is like the wage growth is slowing. Even though it's only 1 month of report, it actually corroborates what the Beige Book narrative is also telling us. So our read of the Beige Book that was released last week is that it was pretty downbeat. And across most of the districts, contacts were talking about how there are more job applicants for all the jobs, while the turnover within the same firm is lower, so less people are quitting. So what this means is that the people who are looking for jobs would take a longer time being in the unemployed state. And usually, this tends to drive unemployment rate up persistently. It's not just a 1 month thing. Usually it will become a trend thing when you see such a phenomenon.
Yeah, those continuing claims up to nearly 2 million last week, Mike.
Continuing claims do show that the labor market seems to be getting a little looser. People who get jobless benefits are taking longer to find jobs, which is what you would expect in this situation. I thought perhaps one of the most interesting things, not just the the sort of shading of their views by Chris Waller and Loretta Mester, was in the Beige Book when we saw for the first time since the recovery began, companies saying they are beginning to accept the idea that they might lay people off and that they're not filling jobs because of attrition. It's not a huge trend yet, but it's a break with what the narrative, to use the term again, has been that we have this very strong labor market. It does seem to be finally loosening up. And I think that's the point that Chris Waller was making, that what we have now is an economy that is feeling the lagged impacts of the rate increases.
So we may have hit peak employment because of that?
Well, it depends on how you define peak employment. The economy continues to add jobs, but the question is, do we see unemployment go up or the number of jobs created go down significantly, which is what the Fed is expecting, but not so far, analysts and economists surveyed by Bloomberg.
Well, so let's talk about what's coming up this Friday, the November jobs report. What are you expecting to see?
So we are definitely focusing more on what's happening to the unemployment rate as opposed to putting too much weight on the headline non-farm payroll. So that said, we are expecting the unemployment rate to climb to 4%. That's versus the 3.9% from the previous month, and for non-farm payroll to add about 150,000 jobs. And let me qualify those numbers for a little bit. So in terms of the non-farm payroll headline, we are the 150K that we are expecting. Well, that includes the 30K that's added from the resolution of the UAW strike. So if you smooth it over a couple of months, in fact, that underlying pace of job growth is actually lower than 150K. And then in terms of the unemployment rate, a 4.0 unemployment rate would trigger the SOMS rule, as well as a whole bunch of other recession rules. So Bill Dudley and I looked at about 28 rules of thumbs on that tends to have a very good record of calling for calling in real time a recession. And we look at, for example, the U1 unemployment rate. That unemployment rate captures how many of the unemployed have been so for 15 weeks or longer. And whenever that U1 unemployment rate increases persistently, it is usually a harbinger of a recession already in place. And also there's another unemployment rate called U2 unemployment rate, and it captures the layoffs and the temporary workers who are unable to find jobs anymore. And that part actually has not triggered any rules yet. And so we would be keeping an eye on all those U1, U2, U3 unemployment rate, because it tells you various parts of the labor market. And what that tells me so far is that, number one, layoffs has not really happened yet. Mass layoffs has not happened yet. That's the U2 unemployment rate. However, people who are unemployed indeed has been taking longer and longer to find a job. That's U1 unemployment rate. And overall, that should drive U3 unemployment rate up, which is the typical metric for measuring whether a recession has happened.
And it makes the jobs report much more interesting. Many more indicators to dive into there. I think one of the things that we do want to see, besides unemployment, which she gave a very good description of, is whether or not job creation does slow. If we got 120,000, which is approximately what Anna's talking about in terms of job creation X strikers being added back, that would be much closer to what the Fed thinks is the minimum needed to absorb new entrants to the labor force, to basically keep us kind of neutral. And they wouldn't think that's bad at all. I'm not sure how the markets would react to that. Right now, the Bloomberg consensus is 175,000, which one assumes includes that 30,000. So it's a little bit stronger than the Bloomberg economics number. But I would also caution that over the coming week, we'll get a lot more of the input data that people look at when they make their forecasts. So that could be revised by the time we get to Friday morning.
What kind of jobs are we absorbing here?
Well, mostly what we have been seeing is healthcare jobs and still some leisure and hospitality jobs. Leisure hospitality is the category that has not regained all of its employment yet from the pandemic. So we probably will see more in that category. It will be interesting to see what we see in terms of retail because, of course, this is the time of year when retailers add temporary employees, and there's anecdotal reporting that they've added fewer than in previous years. But does that mean we're adding more people in warehousing and transportation, which is where sort of the Amazon and Walmart workers end up in those situations over the holidays? So that's going to be something to look at in the jobs report as well.
Well, we'll find out this Friday. And our thanks to Anna Wong, Chief U.S. Economist with Bloomberg Economics, and Michael McKee, Bloomberg International Economics and Policy Correspondent. And coming up on Bloomberg Daybreak Weekend, we head to Europe and look at some key data coming out of the auto industry there. I'm Tom Busby, and this is Bloomberg. I'm Tom Busby in New York. Up later in our program, Congress continues its funding battles. But first, in the UK, we get fresh data on the number of new car registrations in the coming days. The sector has shown some signs of recovery recently, but manufacturers still battling against a challenging post-Brexit economic environment, including painful tariffs on electric vehicles. For more, let's go to London and bring in Bloomberg Daybreak Europe anchor Caroline Hepker.
Tom, only a few days ago, Nissan announced more than £2 billion of investment into the British car industry. The Japanese car maker will set up another battery factory and produce more electric vehicles at its plant in Sunderland. The government is supporting this investment, which is the latest attempt to inject life into an industry that continues to grapple with the lasting effects of the 2016 Brexit vote. So, can the UK really compete as the industry shifts towards electric vehicles? We're thinking about this, of course, in the context of new car registrations data that is due in the next few days. Bloomberg's global automotive editor, Craig Trudell, has been speaking to me about it. I began by asking him just to give us a reading on the current state of the UK car market sales overall.
On the surface, the numbers have looked pretty good lately. We've had 15 consecutive months of growth. That's obviously, that sounds great. But so has the European market, and so it's really sort of a matter of kind of keeping up with the Joneses in that respect. It's also the case that, as you alluded to, we're still a long ways from where we were pre-pandemic. So back in 2019, there were 2.3 million new cars registered in the UK. Last year, there was 1.6 million, so about 700,000 units short of where we were before the pandemic, and so we're still a long ways from where we were before before the industry dealt with this massive disruption. So, in terms then of how important the UK car market actually is to these car makers, just put that into context for us. Yeah, for all the challenges the UK has been having, it is still Europe's number 2 market after Germany. It's also one of the more important markets in the world for premium and higher end vehicles. So you still have quite a bit of wealth on the part of consumers in the UK. A lot of the luxury brands do quite well here. So it is a very important market, even if it has, faded in relevance to some degree, I would say, especially on the manufacturing side. Okay, so then on that side of things, how important was the announcement from Nissan, for example, that £2 billion worth of investment? Well, Sunderland is a massive factory. It's Nissan's largest assembly plant in the world, and it's really crucial that the UK was able to sort of solidify its future, especially what we've seen over the last half decade or so. So car production here slumped last year to the lowest since 1956. You could chalk that up to a few factors. Honda closed a plant here in 2021. You had Stellantis, shift a car factory to vans, which, don't count toward cars, of course, but it's also, a lower volume plant as a result of that shift. You've seen JLR sort of shift, up market to higher value, lower volume products. And so, the UK now is down to 4 major manufacturers at this point. You have Nissan and JLR that kind of compete for top dog status and go back and forth. You have BMW and Mini, and you have Toyota, and those 4 are sort of what we have left.
Wow. For an industry that has been so crucial for successive governments, right, that was sort of kicked off really going back as far as Thatcher. The issue then with that, how much has the government currently had to help in order to keep those names here and in production? As you say, I remember the reporting around Sunderland. The real worry was around a lot of potential job losses.
Yeah, we had a good story just this week as the UK announced, this manufacturing plan, and I think it was £2 billion that they were committing to auto manufacturing specifically. I think there's been a really interesting sort of reluctance to sort of be drawn into the sort of subsidy wars that have kicked off. You had, of course, the Inflation Reduction Act in the U.S. Has been hugely controversial, even among some of America's allies. You've seen Canada react to that in an extremely aggressive way and throw billions of dollars at companies like Volkswagen to get them to make battery investments. I think the UK has both been reluctant, as I mentioned, to be drawn into that, but I don't think that they can fully exclude themselves. There is some element of needing to bring investment in by sort of offering some major incentives, and that's always been how the game has been played in this industry because of the number of jobs and high value employment that this industry brings. It's sort of inherent to the way plant locations get decided.
Yeah, absolutely. Stuck with that competition, got to deal with it. What about the problem though of this sort of post-Brexit issue? How significant are these tariffs meant to come in on the 1st of January?
It would be really significant, and I think it would be embarrassing, honestly, both for the UK government and for Brussels. I think there was good intention here. There was really an interest in getting the EV supply chain localized in the UK and in Europe, but there have been real challenges with the industry making progress on that front. Here in the UK, you had British Volt, a startup that had big ambitions but wasn't able to execute on them. You've had in Europe in general just sort of slow progress in getting the supply chain up and running, and so again, good intentions. It made sense to try and push the industry in that direction, but given how far behind the industry is and sort of getting that set up, and it's really sort of across the board. Even Tesla is behind in localizing battery production in its German plant. If nothing is done before the end of the year, we're talking about tariffs between the EU and the UK, two very important trade partners to one another, tariffs being put on each other's EVs that wouldn't apply to, say, China. And of course, that would not go over particularly well, especially when consumers already are sort of balking at buying EVs because they're already too expensive.
Yeah, and so unusually, you've got this, actually, the car industry on both sides of the channel, in Europe and the UK, you really wanting some mitigation measures. So what's the EU proposing on that front? Yeah,
it's interesting. 3 options being proposed here. One being do nothing, which I think is quite unlikely that will happen, because again, I think it would be embarrassing to sort of for Europe and the UK to put themselves in this position. There's a complicated short-term measure of sort of kicking the can down the road by 1 year that would be complicated just from a sort of logistical standpoint. The other option that the industry is pushing for is a much longer delay here, roughly 3 years, and of course it would necessarily it would to some degree not necessarily reflect well on the industry that it's taking them this much time, but I also think it's a sort of reality that it does take an industry this big and this complicated to make these sorts of longer term investments. And if the industry were to sort of rush into them before the consumer is ready and before or sort of under duress, you sort of raise the odds that we have problems and put EVs out there that aren't ready, and with batteries that are problematic. We've seen a lot of sort of teething issues on the part of the industry with battery fires and so forth.
Thank you so much for being with us. Craig Trudell is Bloomberg's global automotive editor, looking at one of the key issues facing the UK's car industry. I'm Caroline Hepker here in London. You can catch us every week weekday morning for Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, beginning at 6 a.m. in London. That's 1 a.m. on Wall Street. Tom.
Our thanks to Bloomberg Daybreak Europe anchor Caroline Hepker. And coming up on Bloomberg Daybreak Weekend, China trying to improve trade relations with another vital partner. Not the U.S., though. I'm Tom Busby, and this is Bloomberg. I'm Tom Busby in New York with your global look ahead at the top stories for investors in the coming week. The European Union has said it does not want to decouple from China, but rather de-risk parts of its relationship. So with a summit coming up between the two blocs, how might China and the EU navigate their dialogue on improving their trade relationship? For more, let's get to Bloomberg Daybreak Asia co-host Brian Curtis.
Tom, China and the European Union are set to hold a summit on December 7th and 8th. The European Commission and Council presidents Ursula von der Leyen and Charles Michel will travel to China. One of the big issues of late, China is concerned about the European Union's launch of an anti-subsidy investigation into the imports of electric vehicles. This summit comes around after a series of high-level dialogues of late, and these happened earlier this year on issues including trade and foreign policy. Joining us now is Jenny Marsh, Bloomberg team leader for Greater China and the economics and government team. Jenny, thanks so much for being with us. So this is the first face-to-face or in-person summit with Beijing's leadership for Europe in some 4 years. A lot is expected. What can we expect?
Yeah, I mean, a lot's expected, and at the same time, almost nothing is expected because, you know, these two blocs, they're at a really low point in their ties at the moment. It's extremely acrimonious, and, you know, they're going to obviously be talking about the differences in trade. And I think, you know, market access is what this trip is all going to come down to. And, you know, neither side has really much room to give. I think, you know, obviously front and center for the Chinese is this probe into its subsidies and support for the EV market. And the Europe has been saying to China that it needs to cooperate with this probe because it's very hard for Europe to come to a fair conclusion if it doesn't have visibility over all the different ways, you know, that China does support its EV industry. So they're going to be looking for more access there. You know, China's position on this is very clear. They think that the Europeans are being unfair, and they say they have this kind of full supply chain of the things that you need to create EVs in China, and lots of the raw materials for batteries, for example, are made in China and processed in China, which reduces costs. So they each have their own positions on this, and it's going to be probably at the heart of the discussions, although there are other issues around the trade relationship and just the bilateral relationship in general they'll be discussing.
It raises the question, I suppose, it's really a dilemma, whether or not as a major trading bloc like Europe, whether you can reduce your economic dependence on China without souring relations.
It's difficult. I mean, Italy seems to have managed very gracefully to sort of bow out of the BRI while maintaining its relationship with China. But I think what China does really take umbrage at is sort of this kind of de-risking framework, which, you know, I mean, it was the Europeans, it was von der Leyen who coined that phrase. While de-risking is more palatable than decoupling, to China it's actually the same thing with a different name. And essentially that means sort of ring-fencing big parts of your economy from the Chinese. And often it's those parts of the economies that they really care about. You know, from the US side, it's the high-tech chips. And so, yeah, it creates these tensions. And it's hard to separate the trade relationship from the bilateral relationship. And actually, I mean, Europe is telling China on Dombrovski's visit earlier this year, he made it very clear that they don't see the human rights side, for example, as separate to trade and the economic relationship. So increasingly, they're both moving away from this idea like you can trade with someone, but you can disagree on, you know, fundamental values. Now that's sort of changing a bit, and both sides actually are linking those two different sides of the relationship more.
It's been highlighted that what Europe is looking for is a level playing field. And as you mentioned, one of the ways that we can kind of look at that is the trade surplus that China enjoys with Europe. It's massive. It's more than 400 billion euros. So you're wondering, how do you right size that? In other words, what could China buy from Europe more to help change that relationship?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. There are all these different sort of restrictions at the moment on European cosmetics that the Europeans are going to be lobbying to get removed, and also on instant formula. So there's trade barriers there which are holding back European companies. The French particularly are concerned about the cosmetics barriers. So that's something that the Europeans could lobby for. Whether or not that will be sufficient to sort of to narrow that huge trade deficit that you mentioned, I'm unsure of, but it's sort of it's going to be a bigger problem going forward. This is not going to go away because China's being very clear. You had Pan Gongsheng talking in Hong Kong this week about how China needs to sort of back away from its sort of property-led growth and to sort of put money into these sort of new emerging green markets, which, EVs is one of them. If China ramps up its manufacturing capacity in those areas, what Europe and others are worried about is sort of China's going to flood the market essentially because it has built a sufficient amount of the factories it needs to meet domestic demand right now. So where does that excess go?
And one of the other areas that we haven't talked about is the commodities, the crucial commodities that Europe buys from China. And there's a little bit of complication with that because China is now talking about actually limiting the possible sales of certain types of rare earth minerals, for instance. And so it may be difficult for Europe to either raise or reduce its economic dependence on China when it comes to commodities.
This is sort of one of the few areas where China actually has some leverage. I think, it's found it difficult to respond to US and European sort of trade curves in the past, but its kind of dominance in the market of rare earths is something that China does have in its toolbox. Although it sort of already granted licenses for the export of some of these minerals that it did put the restrictions on. The Commerce Ministry has sort of given the green light for China to export. And so it still remains to be seen how strictly China is going to enforce those. But it's a reminder to the Europeans that, if they press ahead with this EV probe and they come out with a bunch of sort of tariffs on Chinese EVs at the end of it, then China does have ways it can respond that could hurt the European market.
And why hasn't China actually confirmed this summit yet?
This is sort of how China does diplomacy. It's sort of baffling to the rest of the world, but they very rarely confirm these kind of events until the last minute. I guess because it just gives them some wiggle room. If they want to move things, they don't have to then backtrack because they never said anything in the first place. It also just adds that kind of instability, I suppose, to the European side. We could call this off still. We haven't confirmed it in public. It's kind of petty. But this is just sort of textbook and how the Chinese do it. And there isn't really too much to be read into it.
So the U.S., in describing its relationship and its aims on the relationship with China, says it wants to de-risk but not decouple. Does Europe have a position in particular on how it is either reducing its dependence or even disengaging from China?
The Europeans are the architects of the de-risking idea in terms of the language. And there were some reports earlier this year where they did sort of identify, national security, it's national security through economic security, so it's sensitive technologies. So it's very much in line with the US position, apart from they haven't adopted the sort of measures that the Americans have about, areas where American companies can invest or limiting access to sort of the chips. But they also don't have the same level of technology that the Americans do right now. So they're still really working through how they see the implementation of de-risking. They're sort of a couple of steps behind the US.
And just finally, just a bit of fun. Obviously, European brands are very big in China, very well known, particularly in the luxury end of the market. Are there Chinese brands that are known well in Europe?
Not too many. I mean,
BYD maybe.
BYD is the one, probably. And I think the Europeans would rather it be less well known.
All right, Jenny, thanks so much for joining us. Jenny Marsh with us, Bloomberg team leader for a Greater China EcoGov. I'm Brian Curtis, along with Doug Krisner. You can catch us every weekday here for Bloomberg Daybreak Asia, beginning at 7 a.m. in Hong Kong and 6 p.m. on Wall Street. Tom?
Our thanks to Bloomberg Daybreak Asia co-host Brian Curtis. And coming up on Bloomberg Daybreak Weekend, A look at a busy week ahead in Washington. I'm Tom Busby, and this is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Daybreak Weekend, our global look ahead at the top stories for investors in the coming week. I'm Tom Busby in New York. It's going to be a busy week ahead in Washington as Congress continues its funding battles and some key hearings, including testimony from some of the biggest names in the business world, appear before the Senate. For more, let's head to our Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington and Bloomberg Sound On co-host Kaylee Lyons.
Yeah, Tom, this coming Wednesday is going to be a big day for big bank speak on Capitol Hill. The CEOs of all 8 GSIBs, global systemically important banks, will be appearing before the Senate Banking Committee for the annual oversight of Wall Street firms hearing. So Jamie Dimon, Brian Moynihan, Jane Fraser, David Solomon, James Gorman, Charlie Scharf, and even Robin Vince of BNY Mellon and Ron O'Hanley of State Street, they'll all be testifying. It's a really important hearing. In fact, it's so important that Sonali Basak, Bloomberg TV's global finance correspondent, is going to be making the trip from New York down here to Washington to cover it. And she's joining us now. So, Sonali, let's just talk about themes first. What do you expect is going to come up in this hearing?
Well, there's 2 things. One, there's the agenda of the lawmakers, and then there's the agenda of the bankers themselves. Now, you have to remember that you have policymakers really trying to firm up rules around bank capital moving forward, and those rules are now in their comment period. So what is now happening is you're going to see the big U.S. banks, the CEOs of them, take this opportunity to really make the case on why these rules would be too stringent and start to choke off some of the economic activity because they have to hold more capital against the work that they do. Now, from the lawmakers' perspective, they have other questions, and you saw it right when the hearing was announced in the first place. Sherrod Brown, I quote, said that Wall Street's mega banks continue to make record profits and to reward corporations that raise prices on Americans. So inflation will still be a question, and also, like we've seen in the prior year, we will also see them question why most Americans have not seen the effect of higher interest rates through their savings accounts because rates have not risen very meaningfully relative to how quickly rates have risen, been risen by the Federal Reserve.
Yeah, I think the capital requirements part especially could be interesting and possibly contentious because there are plenty of Republicans on the Banking Committee who have been pretty vocally opposed to the Basel III endgame and those higher requirements. Basically, all of the Republican senators, in fact, had written a letter to the Fed kind of casting doubt on whether the Fed should really be pursuing this. So I guess the bankers will be more aligned with that party, and it could be a little bit more contentious with the Democrats.
Well, it's interesting that you mention that, too, because you have this just a week after. This hearing comes a week after Jamie Dimon was pretty public at the CNBC New York Times Deal Book Conference. I'm very sorry. And he says that even liberals should be supporting Nikki Haley. And you're seeing this big call by Wall Street to support her as a presidential candidate. And it does have a lot to do with her views around the economy and around domestic policy as well as international policy.
Yeah, so I'm sure there are going to be plenty of juicy headlines coming out of this hearing. There also is the question, Sonali, and this kind of comes back to the reason why capital requirements might be higher in the first place, is we are now, 8-9 months out of the start of the bank failures of 2023 with SVB. Are they going to tell us there's still reasons to worry about the health of the banking system, or is this going to be a message of nothing more to see here, guys, we're fine?
Well, let's see how tempered that they might be, because remember that these banks are slated to pay a lot more in terms of a special assessment to the FDIC, which is an agency under a lot of fire for its own practices in many ways. But the banks are feeling the burn of that, and the biggest banks are paying the most into that special assessment.
All right. Well, I'm really looking forward to your coverage of this coming week. Sonali Basak, Bloomberg TV's global finance correspondent, thank you so much. And Tom, get ready for Wall Street to head to Washington.
Thank you, Kaylee. That was Bloomberg Sound On co-host Kaylee Lyons reporting from our Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. And you can hear Sound On weekdays 1 to 3 p.m. Wall Street time on Bloomberg Radio. That does it for this edition of Bloomberg Daybreak Weekend. Join us again Monday morning at 5 a.m. Wall Street time for the latest on the markets overseas and the news you need to start your day. I'm Tom Busby. Stay with us. Top stories and global business headlines are coming up right now.